Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I'm Sally Ganga from College Coach. And so the big question is, are you trying to decide between a small liberal arts and sciences college or a public university? Or do you think you already know your top choice, but you haven't given the other option a chance? Listen in, because for our second segment, I'll be interviewing Brittany Preston, a colleague and former admission officer at the University of Colorado at Boulder and Oregon State University Cascades, about public school options. Then Neal Relay, formerly of Middlebury, Colorado, and Lewis and Clark colleges, and current colleague, will be chatting with me about small liberal arts and sciences colleges. And of course, given my background at Reed and Whittier colleges, I'll obviously be chiming in with my opinions as well. But first, if you're watching this on video, I'll be chatting with my colleague and college finance expert, Robyn Stewart, who you'll see here with me, about how being an international student here in the US on a visa will impact what you pay. Basically, what it is to be an international student, because if you're an international student here, you have to be on a visa, correct, Robyn?
That is correct. Well, yeah, we'll define, let's for purposes of today, why don't we just define what we're going to mean, who we mean by international students. So not US citizens, not permanent residents. Okay, so who is an international student? So the traditional international student is somebody here on an F1 student visa. Okay, but a lot of the work we do, and for purposes of today, I'd like to include in that group students who've been living in the US and maybe they're here on, an H dependent visa. Their dad or mom is here on a work visa, or maybe like an intercompany transfer visa, like an L visa, and they're a dependent. So they're also kind of grouped in that international student category.
Okay, good. So really, if you're not a permanent resident, then you count for this conversation.
Correct. Yep.
Okay. All right. So what resources can international students use to help pay for college? I mean, that is pretty challenging given that a lot of aid usually comes from the government, correct?
It is, right. And international students or non-immigrant visa holders are not eligible for federal aid. I mean, the biggest question I get, right, from families is, what is this school going to cost me? Talk to me about affordability, what resources are available, specifically scholarships. So it's important to do your research early. And some of the resources that I mentioned, so I'm going to let's give a big shout out to the blog and YouTube. I do know on our blog, we have several great post on the financial piece, the scholarship search piece, or merit aid, different things like that for international students, but also, of course, the admissions process. So
okay, and I just want to chime in quickly. Sorry, it's blog.getintocollege.com is what she's talking about. Yeah.
And the YouTube channel as well has some videos that were designed specifically for international students. But in addition to our great resources, a couple of things I like to mention when I'm talking to families, there is the Education USA Network, which is through the Department of State. So there are, I'm going to screw this up, I think it's about 430 student centers, so advising centers in something like 170, maybe 75 countries. And their website's great. It has the academic info, funding opportunities. So that's a great place to kind of get started. And as you're building your list of schools, because any advice we'd give, not only to international students, but any student, you want to start with a well-structured list of schools. So this is a good site. Another site I like for that is a nonprofit organization, the Institute of International Education. They have academic searching, academic program information. There is a scholarship database, so that's another good one. And the website is www.iie.org. Okay. And the other one I just want to mention before we kind of dive a little bit deeper into the types of resources is International Education and Financial Aid. So that website is www.ief, like Frank, a.org. This one's more aid scholarship focused rather than academic. But what I like as well, students can connect with other students on this site and learn about, you're at XYZ school. What was your experience like? How did you manage cost? That whole thing. So those are some good starting points. I think as far as diving a little deeper into resources, institutional aid is really where it's at for international students, right? Merit aid, another way people might know it. This is money that's coming directly from the college, okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's the largest resource for any family. And so this is money that's typically awarded based on information from your admissions application, in a variety of ways, right? Some schools may designate some of this money for special populations, right? So St. Lawrence University has a Kenya scholarship program for students from that country. Or, it could be academics, your intended major, special leadership skills. Academics is a very big way money is given out. So at American University, for example, they have the Emerging Global Leader Scholarship. So you can certainly ask schools about, do they offer merit aid to international students? What are the deadlines? Is there a separate process? Number of international students each cycle who receive this type of aid? Another good resource, actually, I probably should have included it before. The College Board, right, a site that most people are well aware of, right? International students know the site as well. There's a spreadsheet on the College Board site that is available with a listing of schools. It's all U.S. schools, who offer merit aid, the average award, that kind of thing. So it's another great tool for doing your research. So I've been talking merit aid, institutional money from the colleges, the external or private scholarship process that certainly international students should look into if they're trying to, get some funds for college. They're awarded the same way. It's for a student who's studying marketing, a student from South America. It does work similarly. Those tend to be smaller awards, right, than the larger dollars coming from the colleges. But it is another resource that they could take advantage of.
Mm-hmm. I want to put in a plug too. I mean, I worked at Whittier, which as well as University of Chicago and, Reed College, and Whittier was the least selective of those schools, but a school I really believe in. We brought in tons of international students, or I don't know, tons, but for a small college, it was a notable amount. And I think that students don't always think about, a lot of international families kind of think about the same 20 schools, but those are going to be the toughest ones, A, to get into, and B, to get merit scholarships from, if they give merit aid at all. But a Whittier is going to be easier, and then you're in the US and you're still getting a really wonderful education. So I just want to put in a plug to look beyond the schools you may have already heard about.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I think that was on my mind to try to remember to mention as well, right? It's that difference between selectivity and the discount you can get with merit aid. Absolutely. Other types of resources, just to kind of, at a high level here, some schools actually offer need-based aid to international students. And that's also knowable early in the process, right? If you can get it at a school, if you qualify, you're going to be required to complete some applications. Of course, you have to look at your family's financial situation and household and all of that. The CSS profile. So again, a form on the College Board, another reason to know the College Board. International Student Financial Aid application is a secondary application that some schools use. Not every school, though, offers need-based aid. And the other thing is, if it is a school, like I think of University of Pennsylvania, right? They meet need of any student they accept. However, if you're an international student who applies there, they're going to look at your admissions application with a little sharper lens. It might be harder to get in, right? If you're applying for need-based aid.
And it's already so hard to get in.
Right,
so
right.
Let's just say, I think MIT is the only school I know for sure that makes no distinction between international and domestic students.
Yeah. It's not widespread. Not every school does this, but certainly for the right family, the right, it could be another resource. Something I want to mention is in-state tuition, which isn't technically a resource, but it's a discount you can get. So not for the F1 students, right? The traditional student visa kids. But for people who've lived here, like I was mentioning, for a couple of years, the H dependents, the L dependents, they may be able to take advantage of this. So this means instead of paying the higher cost at their in-state public, they can be looked at depending on there's some criteria to classify students for tuition purposes. And so a lot of the conversations we have with families is actually, looking at maybe the primary or public school in that state, showing them where the registrar's office is, or putting, letting them know you got to talk to the, I'm trying to think what it's called in California, like the deputy officer or somebody who reviews this during the admissions process. But that could be potentially another way for these families to save a little bit of money. And to your point about, selectivity before, I would add community college as a resource. So you think about a community college, there's a lower cost initially, right? And a lot of them have great transfer pathways to four-year schools where you'll eventually get that four-year degree from the US. So if cost is a consideration, international students could certainly look at community colleges as a good option for saving some money.
Yeah, I mean, schools like Penn State, for example, I think 50% of who graduate from Penn State University Park have transferred in. I mean, it's a remarkable percentage. So this is really a very common experience at some schools, less so at the at the well-known privates. But yeah, I can't emphasize enough that community college can be a great place to start.
Agreed. So the next kind of question, or the next resource I would think about, would be student loans, which I know nobody likes to think about loans, but they're technically a resource as well. And as we said before, international students aren't eligible for federal loans, but they may be able to take advantage of loans from their home country. So like I'm working with a Canadian student right now, and we were talking about the Canadian student loan program. So provincial loans that you can use here in the, in the US, at US schools. There are some other schools. So typically, in my experience, these are more like the really selective schools. So like an Amherst College or Dartmouth, maybe. They have institutional loans. So these are programs that the schools offer students who are not able to borrow from the federal program, right? So still a resource. It's not going to be widespread, but that could be something you could add to, like your checklist of resources for, as you research schools. There's private lenders, right? So this is where it gets a little tricky, where, typically a lender has to have a relationship with the school in order to provide financing to the families. I think at the end of the day, if you're an international student who can get a US citizen or permanent resident as a co-signer for a loan, you'll have more options. So that could be something, again, if you're planning early, think about, who might fit that role.
Any last bit of advice, or was that kind of the main the main advice? Have a friend. Have a good friend. Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely do your research, start early. And there's lots of resources out there. You want to make a 4-year plan. For this. It's not a year-to-year thing. I mean, you do, as an international student, in many cases, have to show proof of funding for a year of study. Be proactive, reach out to the international student office or the international admissions representative. And then this is something that I've started talking to students about. There's lots of student cultural groups on social media at different schools across the country. Join a couple groups and find out what their experiences was coming from, your home country to this particular school. What's the cost of living like in a certain part of the state or country that you've never been to before? You have to kind of think about the big picture, not just the cost of the school.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think cost of living is really important. Like, you may want to be in New York or LA or Washington, DC, but honestly, Grinnell, Iowa is going to be a lot cheaper. Like,
that is true.
So just some things to think about that way as well. So, all right. Well, listen, thank you so much for your time today.
Sure. One of my favorite topics to talk about. Good seeing you, Sally.
Okay. Good to see you too. All right. When we return, I'll be welcoming Brittany Preston.